I'm Carol Boucher, and as chair of the Planning Committee, I would like to welcome you to our workshop webcast today, where we will be exploring dietary and nutrition assessment in older adults. Throughout this workshop series, we will be discussing very important issues in nutrition care and surveillance. We'd like to extend our thanks to the National Institutes of Health's Office of Dietary Supplements for sponsoring this very important work, which we hope will advance the conversation about how we can provide high levels of dietary assessment for older adults. We have assembled a planning committee of experts on this topic and invited speakers who can provide us with insights on evidence to inform best practice. A few administrative notes to mention. Session moderators will briefly introduce each of the speakers before their presentations. Additional information about speakers, moderators, and planning committee members is also available on the workshop meeting webpage. During the designated discussion portion of this workshop, we will be taking questions both from the community members and from the audience, who may submit their questions to the email on the project website. We ask that you please state your affiliation and preferred name when asking your questions. Written summaries of the presentations and discussions will be published in the coming months. And so without further ado, I would like to invite our session moderators, Drs. Heather Keller and Reagan Bailey, to start the session.
I knew that would happen. I forget to turn on my microphone, the typical complaint of everyone who's on Zoom. Anyway, welcome today. And I just want to confirm that I have the right slide deck out. You see the full slide and not the presenter slides? Yep. Great, we're ready to go. So thanks again, Carol, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to moderate this session with my colleague, Reagan Bailey. And before we get into the actual speakers for today's workshop, which is very exciting to have, by the way, we're so glad to have you today. I wanted to give a brief overview of the demographic changes we are seeing worldwide and why this topic has come up essentially for discussion today and through the next 3 workshops that we have going on. So these slides are from the UN and actually the Population Division that has created a variety of surveillance materials and tracking of aging across the world. And this really gives a good sense, a nice visual of why aging is the topic for what we're working with respect to diet and surveillance, and why it's so incredibly important worldwide, why we should be talking about diet and health in older adults. So this is today, or recently this week, I guess, in 2022, what the world looked like with respect to the percentage of people over the age of 65. And you can see that large portions of the world are 20 to 30% over the age of 65, whereas other regions are more around the area of 5 to 10%. But what's important to note is that only about 60 years or so ago, most of the world was only at the 5 to 10% mark for the proportion of people over the age of 65. So the world is rapidly aging, as we know. And in addition to that rapid aging of the world, we're also seeing a narrowing of the gap in life expectancy. So in 1950, on the far left-hand side, you can see that the darkest blue color, which were some regions of the world, and then the darkest green sections were anywhere from 15 to 20 years of further life expectancy after the age of 65. And there were several regions where it was yellow and light yellow, would be less than 5 years. On the right-hand side, you see what is the case in 2025. And you can see that we actually have much higher proportions of the world that are going to have long-lived age now, right? And so much more blue and dark green as well. So we're shifting in terms of not only aging society, but the gap in life expectancy that we used to see dependent on regions of the world is now narrowed, and many people are living to the age of 80. And that's what our next slide actually shows us, is the life expectancy at, again, this week I looked at what would be the life expectancy at birth. If we looked at 2025 to 2030, the median that we're looking at for both sexes, you can see that much of the world is going to expect to see people living over the age of 70 years and a high proportion over the 80 years. So this means we need to be thinking about what that impacts in terms of our health, our society, our economies, etc. I wanted to briefly give you a sense of why diet is so important here. And I'm sure we'll hear more from our colleagues, Luigi especially. I know he's got some discussion about frailty and diet. But we know that long-lived parts of the world have diet as a part of that reason of that long-lived scenario. And this is just a recent publication looking at the 9 habits of longevity. And 2 of those habits you can see are food focused, so eating more plants and stopping eating when you're 80% full. The World Health Organization over the last decade or so has recognized this growing demographic change that we need to think about how to address. And so before this current decade, 2021 to 2030, which has been designated by the World Health Organization as the decade of healthy aging, they've been working towards putting out a variety of planning and profiling documents to help get countries around the world engaged in this conversation. Most recently, in 2021, they put out their baseline report around healthy aging. And they describe healthy aging as the process of developing and maintaining functional ability that enables well-being in older age. And they essentially equate functional ability with not being frail. And we know from a variety of research that's been done over the last 20 years or so that diet and frailty are closely connected. Not only is food intake associated with frailty, but frailty, sarcopenia, and malnutrition often are overlapping conditions in individuals. And nutrition is likely a modifiable factor that has at least some place in addressing frailty. It can't address all frailty because we know it's quite a complex, multi-component reason why individuals might be frail. But diet probably plays some role in that frailty. So to meet the goal of healthy aging, we in this workshop series over the next month or so will be addressing some key questions to help us move forward as a community of researchers and stakeholders interested in food and diet and how we can start to address this issue and meet the goal of healthy aging by 2030 and beyond. So the workshop series will be addressing some of these questions. And I've highlighted for you what are the questions we're hoping to address in the workshop topics, as you can see below. So what are older adults eating? The workshop series 1 will be, or workshop 1, I should say, is going to be addressing the dietary nutrition assessment in older adults and the issues and current status of our diet assessment in this group. Workshop 2 will also address the advances and key issues in dietary assessment of older adults. Another question is, how do we identify older adults who are not eating well? And this will be addressed in workshop 3, focusing on nutrition screening specifically in older adults. And then finally, the last question that I'm hoping we are going to be seeing that we address in this workshop series is, how do we support older adults to improve their food intake? And our final workshop will be looking at practices, challenges, and policy. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Regan to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Heather, for providing that wonderful outline. So we'll now present our first speaker on this topic, Dr. Dorothy Volkart. Dr. Volkart holds a professorship in clinical nutrition of older age people at the Friedrich Alexander University in Nuremberg, Germany. She's a nutrition scientist and received her PhD from the University of Heidelberg and Stuttgart. Her research focuses on nutritional problems of older persons in all healthcare settings and related interventions. She serves as a coordinator and first author of the ESPEN guidelines for clinical nutrition and hydration in geriatrics, and has been involved in leading positions in several national and international research projects. Today, she will be speaking about nutrition today.
Dorothy, I think you might be muted.
So I'm sorry for that, and we'll start. Now you hear me? Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and we'll start again. And thank you for your kind introduction and also for the invitation to present the Nutrition Day project here. I'm really happy about this opportunity, and we'll start with a few words about the project. Many of you may know already the Nutrition Project, which is a worldwide nutrition project. Here you can see the website, the starting website, where you can find all information about the project. So it is a one-day cross-sectional audit. Meanwhile, worldwide, at one day each year, so this year at November 10th, nutritional status and information about nutrition will be collected worldwide in hospitals and in nursing homes. And all institutions are invited to participate free of any costs. It is very easy to participate using standardized questionnaires, which are available also on that website. And data are collected locally by nursing staff mainly in the institutions, and data are entered also via this website in a joint database. So the Nutrition Day project originally, or it is not a real scientific project. It is rather an awareness project, and the original aim of the project was indeed to raise awareness about malnutrition and nutritional problems in institutions, in hospitals and nursing homes. And the vision is to improve awareness and to achieve standardized nutritional assessment in all institutions, and also to bring the topic at the political agenda. As already mentioned, data are collected by standardized questionnaires, and I will now focus on the nursing home part of the Nutrition Day, where mainly old people are participating. So in the hospital part, all patients of all ages can participate, and in nursing home, the focus is on old persons. These two questionnaires are used in the nursing home setting. One collecting information about the institution, the participating unit, with some characteristics about unit size and nutritional routines. And a second questionnaire about the residents, characterizing the resident, and also including nutritional information. And there's a follow-up data collection in the nursing home part after 6 months, where mortality and hospital admissions and also falls during this time are collected. Regarding nutrition and food intake, there are only very few questions. The first one is asking about food intake decline. This question is taken from the M&A, from the mini nutritional assessment, to get an impression about change of food intake during the past 3 months. There's another question about the eating amount in the last week. And finally, dietary intake at lunch on Nutrition Day is assessed by this plate diagram from about all to nothing. So these are all dietary food intake questions. And over the years, a huge database was developed. The project started 2007 in nursing homes, and until 2015, more than 3,000 residents from 20 countries participated. In 2016, the questionnaire was markedly reduced. So from this time on, we have a separate database now until 2020 with more than 10,000 residents from 17 countries. And these two databases are largely overlapping but not identical. And the second one here, as explained, is very much reduced. Research proposals can be submitted to the Nutrition Day office, and the scientific committee of the Nutrition Day organization decides about acceptance of the proposals. Data use agreements will then be signed and data analysis performed either by the Nutrition Day office in Vienna, or data will be transferred to the researchers for own analysis. So the huge advantage of the project, I think, is the large database, which is available meanwhile, with the disadvantage of, unfortunately, only very limited information on dietary intake. So there's no information on energy or nutrient intake. It's just this very rough assessment. There are several publications already available focusing on dietary intake, which you can read if you are interested in more detail. And I also wanted to mention this Nutrition Day annual report, which was just published in Clinical Nutrition Aspen and is available for free download. And here I took the picture about food intake in nursing homes from 2019, where about 1/3 of the residents didn't eat the whole meal. Finally, I have some general comments about dietary assessment in geriatric institutions, where we have mainly more or less physically and mentally impaired residents or patients, where direct dietary assessment by the persons themselves is not possible. Neither recalls for a poor memory nor records are possible in these settings. On the other hand, the menu, the meal plan, is mostly rather well known. Portion sizes are more or less standardized, and dietary assessment should be performed by staff. With these three general options, either the plate diagrams as they're used in the Nutrition Day, which are only very rough estimation. Estimated food records are an option where portion sizes are just estimated, or weighing records are the gold standard, which are, however, also the most time-consuming and laborious option. So with this slide, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Luigi Ferrucci, who is a geriatrician and epidemiologist who conducts research in the causal pathways leading to progressive physical and cognitive decline in older persons. In September 2002, he became the chief of the Longitudinal Studies section at the National Institute of Aging and the director of the Baltimore Longitudinal Study on Aging. And he'll be providing us some information about those studies and the data collection involved in it. In addition, he's been involved in the European Longitudinal Study on Aging, the AKEA study of centenarians in Sardinia, and the Women's Health and Aging study. So lots of experience around large epidemiological investigations and how diet may be measured. So today he's going to be outlining some of the data specifically from the Baltimore data set. So Dr. Ferrucci, you can take it away.
I think you're on mute, Dr. Ferrucci.
Oh, I think I did.
Yep, I can hear you now.
Okay.
You're sharing your screen, but it's dark for me. Is it dark for anyone else?
Yeah, do you see my screen?
No, it's black.
Let me stop sharing and I'm sharing again.
Not a Zoom meeting until there's technical difficulties.
Can you see my slide now?
I'm still seeing that you're sharing your screen, but it's black on my screen.
Yeah, mine too.
Maybe if you have two screens, you might want to switch the view.
I see mine, but I don't know why. Let me try something else. Not sure why.
Perfect.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very good. So I want to start by saying that I've always been convinced that nutrition is really the culprit of how we age. And these slides really represent an example of that. You know, we go from 7, 8 kilograms at 6 months of age to 70, sometimes 80 kilograms when we are adults. And this in proportion is the amount of food we eat in between, 80 tons of food. How is possible that this food does not affect the way we age and our health? And I think that we haven't really touched only the surface of the effect of this. And today, I want to concentrate on the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging contribution, and especially in the context of rating. And I want to start by citing the two people that did the most of the work that I'm going to present. Samira Tagalaware, that is our contribution from Hopkins, and Toshiko Tanaka, who is the staff scientist in my group at the National Institute on Aging. So the dietary assessment in the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging is really two tiers. And the BLSA is a study that started in 1958 and has been going on since 1958. So we have longitudinal data, including dietary data, for some individuals that span 45 to 48 years. So it's a really, really rich database, especially in a longitudinal perspective. We have a 37-day dietary record, and we stopped in 2003 because you know, it's really, really time consuming and labor consuming. And we didn't really have enough people in the study to follow this, but we still are, you know, mining those data. And then we have food frequency questionnaire that was started in 2003 and is still presently available. And we also have another version of the food frequency questionnaire before, started in 1980, but the two we're trying to harmonize the two food frequency questionnaires that have not been completely successful so far. What we do in BLSA mostly is to look at the adherence of older people to a specific type of diet. And here I have 3 examples that are calculated in our database. The Mediterranean diet, that's probably the one that we all focus on because it seems to have the most effectiveness in reducing outcome. The MIND diet, that is a combination of the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet that is supposed to be effective, especially in declining cognitive function, and the alternative eating index that is calculated based on nutritional requirement. And using this, we can calculate score that we can use in our analysis. And this is the percentage in the top tertile, those that have high quality diet using this type of scores. You can see that there is a substantial difference between men and women. So I think that that's something that we need really to look at. There's also different by ethnicity that I'm not going to show you today because the data are still being processed, but the different are substantial. And we see also that there is an age effect, and the age effect seems to be sex dependent. For example, for the Mediterranean diet, we see some effect that not strong in men, a very strong effect in women with a reduced percent of those that have high adherence. And similarly, we see an effect in the MIND diet. So what is the effect of this diet in this relatively healthy population, which is the characteristic population of the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging? This, for example, is the effect of diet on mobility decline. And you can see that why at baseline, the 3 tertiles or adherence to the Mediterranean diet were very, very similar. Over time, those that have low adherence to Mediterranean diet show, a substantial reduction in mobility, and the difference was statistically significant. And then when we look at the single items of the score, when we look at frailty, we see that the effect, and this is a theme that I repeat more and more, it's more related to walking speed, the low physical function, and the effect of muscle strength that we see, at least in our data, is more active and less evident. These are cross-sectional data, but of course, we are much more interested in longitudinal data. And so I wanted you to concentrate on this graph. In the center, where you see frailty index, we use here a frailty index that has 30 items so that we can have a very wide score. And here you see that the red, the low adherence, medium adherence, and high adherence to the Mediterranean diet. And clearly over time, over 10 years, the effect of accelerated frailty, it's very, very evident. And this was absolutely no evident at baseline. And not only there is an effect on physical function, but we also see an effect of cognitive function. And to make a very long story short, the low adherence, especially group, tend to have an accelerated decline of cognitive function. And the effects seem to be attributable mostly to vegetable, fish, legume, fruit, and nuts. And all of them, even singularly, a single element, seem to be statistically significant. If we look at the Mediterranean DASH intervention and the MIND intervention, and here the effect is only on the MIND diet. And we see that, one thing that we see that while these 3 types of diet have been elaborated and processed and created with different outcomes in mind, they act very, very similarly. So in this case, for example, the health ABC score is a physical function score, and you see accelerated decline in those with high adherence. And then again, one of the trends that we're starting to work on is that, the problem with assessing diet is that there is a substantial bias. The people that have a very, very inadequate diet tend to hide it. The people that, there is a regression to the mean. And we have tested that many, many times. So one of the trends is we're trying to evaluate dietary intake and quality of dietary intake by biomarkers, measuring biomarker in the blood and in the urine. And this, for example, is a study that we did in collaboration with our Spanish collaborator, showing that if you look at the total urinary polyphenol, there is a strong effect on mortality, but if you look at total dietary polyphenol that is calculated based on the questionnaire, we don't see any effects, so suggesting that the way to go probably is a combination of the two approaches. And I want to, 2 slides, very short, on mechanism. What are the mechanisms by which, the different diets affect health? And one of the effects is certainly epigenetic. So the exposure to a different diet and to a different component is demonstrated to have a strong effect on some of the biomarker of biological aging. The epigenetic clock is one of them. And for example, in this paper, we demonstrated that, eating fish and vegetable and high socioeconomic status and moderate alcohol consumption were associated with lower epigenetic clock, which means that age progressed much slower, while the central obesity and high triglycerides were associated with faster accelerated aging. Oh, I'm missing a figure here. Meat consumption was also associated with accelerated aging. And the second part, it's about metabolites. And we are now able to do metabolomics in large population. And when I say, the 3 types of diet behave similarly, look at this, how similarly they behave on how they strongly affect metabolites. And one of the observations here is that there are many, many, many metabolites that are changing harmonically with the type of diet to adherence to a particular healthy diet. And so suggesting that the effect of diet is not really mediated by one molecule. Searching for the one magic bullet is not a good idea, because diet show that it's effective across a number of different metabolites. And this is just to close the loop. If you look at the effect of diet on frailty index, for example, and you do a mediation analysis to metabolomics, you find that there is tremendous mediation, between 60 and 80% mediation. And so suggesting that the diet affect the metabolite in the circulation, and they by far affect the frailty index. Please do not cite this. This is a paper that it has been submitted. It's not published yet. But to me, that's important, which means that by looking at metabolites, we can look at an objective measure of the quality of the diet. And when we do an intervention with the diet, we can see whether the metabolites that have been associated with an outcome are changing. And thank you very much for listening to me. And I look forward to listening to other presentations.
Great. Thank you so much for that informative presentation. We're grateful to have you on our panel today. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shin-Young Jun. Dr. Jun is currently a research assistant professor at the National Cancer Center in Korea. Prior to this role, she was a postdoctoral research student at Purdue University, where she received her PhD and postdoctoral fellowship in nutrition science and gerontology. Her research focuses on accurately assessing dietary supplement use and dietary intake, especially in vulnerable population subgroups, and then understanding how these nutrient exposures influence chronic disease outcomes. She has extensive experience utilizing nationally representative survey data from the NHANES, or the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which she will be discussing here today. And Dr. Jun, I see that you are in presenter mode, so if you want to switch your screens, perhaps, we'll be ready to hear your presentation. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Jun.
Thank you for that introduction. Is it working properly now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be a part of this wonderful workshop, and I'm here to present about NHANES, which stands for National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. The NHANES is a nationally representative survey operated by the National Center for Health Statistics at CDC. The NHANES has been a continuous program since 1999 and has collected cross-sectional data from about 5,000 people every year. The target population is the US population of all ages, but more specifically, non-institutionalized civilian resident population in the 50 states and the DC. To represent this enormous target population, multi-stage stratified clustered sampling design is used. This sampling subdomains show you that NHANES aim to represent age, sex, income, and race subgroups reliably. NHANES is one of the most widely used data because it collects a wealth of data. The NHANES has both interview and physical examination components and collects very detailed information about diet and dietary supplement use. To walk you through by timeline, interviewers first visit participants' homes and ask about socioeconomic and demographic information and medical conditions. Interviewers also ask about diet behavior, food security, and food assistance program use here. What is very unique about the NHANES is a product inventory part. When interviewers query about dietary supplement use during the past 30 days, like frequency, dose, and amount, they see and collect the photos of the actual product bottles and labels. Next, participants are invited to the mobile examination center shown in this photo to get body measurements, blood draw, and a variety of clinical examinations. Here, an in-person 24-hour dietary recall is also conducted. Lastly, after 3 to 10 days later, participants get a telephone call for the second 24-hour dietary call. Respondents' responses are typed into the notebook computers of interviewers and are directly transmitted to the NCHS databases. Then the coders at NCHS further process this data and release dietary supplement use data and food and beverage consumption data. Dietary supplement use can be converted to nutrient intakes from supplements by using the NHANES in-house database that's actually based on the labels and the bottles. Food and beverage consumptions can be converted to nutrient intakes from diets by using the USDA's Food and Nutrition Database for Dietary Studies, FNDDS. I have been emphasizing supplement assessment part because the majority of older adults use at least one dietary supplement. This chart from Dash et al. Shows you the very high prevalence of any dietary supplement use among US older adults. The data are from the 30-day questionnaire from the NHANES 2011 to 14. And by age group, we see that the use was significantly higher for those in older age groups than those in 60s. For example, among women 80 years and older, more than 80% reported the use of supplements. Most supplement users reported the use of multiple products, and the most common types were multivitamin and minerals, vitamin D, omega-3, B complexes, calcium and vitamin D, and vitamin C. When looking at foods and beverages only, dietary quality was generally low. Here, our team analyzed the NHANES 11 to 14 data with the aim of assessing nutrition status by body weight status among older adults 60 and older. Dietary quality here was measured by the adherence to the dietary guidelines, which was quantified by the Healthy Eating Index. The mean Healthy Eating Index scores were far from 100, the maximum, and the mean score was even lower in obese older adults than in healthy weight older adults in both men and women. Okay. As we looked at dietary supplement use and dietary quality, the next question would be nutrient intake from both sources. One of the strengths of the NHANES data is that total usable nutrient intake estimation is possible. To introduce a key concept first, usable nutrient intake refers to a long-term average intake of nutrients that can be compared to the recommended levels of intakes, such as the dietary reference intakes. Long-term intake is very hard to measure, but with some statistical techniques, long-term intake can be estimated from short-term measures. For these techniques, at least one 24-hour recall from all participants and the second recall from a subsample is needed, and that's available in the NHANES. Total usable nutrient intake is highlighting a variety of sources of nutrients, including diet, dietary supplements, and sometimes medications. Usable nutrient intake from dietary supplements can be obtained from the 30-day frequency questionnaire. But recently, Dr. Bailey and her team reported that combining 30-day questionnaire and 24-hour recalls may be the best way to capture dietary supplement use. So we estimated total usable intakes for several under-consumed nutrients identified in the dietary guidelines by weight status. And for calcium, magnesium, zinc, vitamin C and D, many men 60 years and older did not meet the estimated average requirement, which is a part of the dietary reference intakes. So they were considered to be at risk of inadequate intake. Magnesium is highlighted here because obese older adults had even higher risk than the healthy weight counterpart. Not shown here, but the inclusion of nutrient intakes from dietary supplements considerably reduced those at risk of inadequate intakes for these nutrients. Among women 60 years and older, the proportion not meeting the requirement was also high for similar nutrients, and the obese group had a higher risk of inadequacy for calcium, magnesium, vitamins B6 and D. One of the implications of these results is that obesity may coexist with micronutrient inadequacy, even though obese people are often assumed to consume enough or too much sometimes. Another finding from the same paper was that health risks may cluster in some subgroups. In the US, about 40% of older adults are considered obese. And as shown before, in addition to the coexistence of obesity, lower dietary quality, and micronutrient inadequacy, also coexisted or self-reported fair or poor overall health, 5 or more medication use, more limitations in daily activities, more metabolic risk factors, SNP participation, and for men only, low income, and for women only, depression. There were also some challenges faced when utilizing the NHANES data. The biggest one is coming from the self-reporting and its consequential recall bias. This would be an issue for all ages, but especially for older adults who may be experiencing cognitive decline. In a few cases where a participant is not able to report for themselves, a proxy may help the reporting, but this may have its own issue too. Another one is that ages over 80 years are top-coded for privacy issue, so that the characterization of the oldest old is challenging. The NHANES targets non-institutionalized older adults and also require the mobile examination center visits. So naturally, the older adult sample may be relatively healthy compared to the entire older adult population in the US. Others include keeping up the dietary supplement database because there are a lot of dietary supplements available in the market, and the cross-sectional study design that lacks temporality. I'd like to wrap up by mentioning some more strengths of this data set. In-home interview in tandem with the product inventory is a useful method to reduce recall bias because interviewers check the label and bottles. And a wealth of social demographic and health information enables identifying vulnerable subgroups. And even the NAs regularly accept submissions of potential content, so can keep up with the current research trends. Blood and urine samples can be used to produce biomarker information that may calibrate self-reported dietary intake if there is a potential a known biomarker. The last but not least, the nationally representative estimates from the NHANES inform health policy and programs. Okay, thank you for listening to my presentation. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Shin-Yun, for that wonderful overview. It's really nice to especially see the highlight on dietary supplements, as well as the richness of the NHANES data set. So next, we're going to be hearing from one of our own committee members, Dr. Roseanne Di Maria Galali. Dr. Di Maria Galali is the Associate Dean for Interprofessional Research and Development and a Professor of Nursing in the College of Nursing and Health Professions, with courtesy appointments in the Nutrition Science Department and School of Biomedical Engineering at Drexel University. She's a geriatric nurse scientist, and her research focus is on integrating nutrition and novel technologies to improve health outcomes and quality of life for older adults with acute and chronic conditions across the care continuum. Roseanne is involved with engineers in developing some new technology with respect to monitoring fluid intake, as well as the Cell to Society Aging Research Network. Today, she's going to be giving us an overview of the findings from the NHATS data set. So welcome, Roseanne.
Thanks, Heather. And can everybody see my screen open?
You look just lovely. The slides look great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for having me today. And I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk a little bit about the prevalence of malnutrition using nationally representative samples using the National Health and Aging Trend Study. As we know, we've been talking about dietary intake assessment thus far, but we also know that older adults are at risk for malnutrition due to a variety of different factors, such as physiological changes with aging, medications, dietary changes, social, economic, and chronic health conditions. But what we know clinically is that many older adults have malnutrition in the hospital setting, and these numbers range from 12 to 72%, depending on which diagnostic criteria you use. And some of the larger data sets using inpatient samples in the US have shown patients coded for malnutrition in the hospital setting tend to be 65 years of age and older, have higher infection rates, and greater morbidity and mortality. And when you look a little bit more closely at that data, you find that older adults with a malnutrition diagnosis in the hospital setting were more likely to be admitted to the hospital from a skilled facility and more likely to be discharged back to a skilled facility. So this really leaves us with some gaps about what is really the nutritional status of community dwelling older adults in the US at a population level. We know that older adults are at risk for malnutrition. We know that there's malnutrition in the acute care setting, but what about in the community? And we've struggled for some time to really get these national representative numbers. We did some data analysis using the Southeast Pennsylvania Household Health Survey almost a decade ago, where we were able to look at compute a mini nutritional assessment score from items that were already in the survey. And we found that in that portion of the state, 6% of community dwelling older adults were malnourished and 54% were at risk. But the question is, can we replicate that more on a national level? And so we really have been working on this, looking at a prevalence of malnutrition in older adults in the community and residential care using secondary analysis of a population-based cohort. So what I'm going to share with you today is some of our data from the National Health and Aging Trend Study, which is a nationally representative sample of Medicare beneficiaries 65 years of age and older. And it was designed for to study late life disability trends and trajectories. It's a longitudinal cohort, which began in 2011, and there's some in-person assessments and questions on medical, social, functional, and technology domains. We were particularly interested in the 2017 round, or round 7, because dried blood samples were obtained at that time, and there's which includes inflammatory biomarkers. And this study, NHATS, is funded by the NIA, and we were able to get permission to use sensitive and restricted access through Hopkins. So as a reminder, the mini nutritional assessment, or the short form, has 6 items that include food intake, weight loss, mobility, psychological stress or acute disease, neuropsychological problems such as dementia or depression, and body mass index. And we were able to then identify similar items in the NHAT survey that align with the MNA so that we could construct an MNA score. And in the data that we'll present, 12 to 14 would be considered normal nutrition status, 6 to 11 at risk, and 0 to 7 malnourished. And we also looked at some other variables such as sociodemographic variables, health status, food security, and inflammation. And initially we had 6,312 individuals in round 7. And then based on our exclusion criteria, our final sample was 4,472. But once we apply the weights, we're now looking at data that represents 31 million older adults in the United States in 2017. And of those older adults, 68% had a normal nutritional status, 26% were at risk, and about 6% were malnourished. So we wanted to do a deeper dive on who these individuals were. And what we found when we started to work on some of these sub-analyses was that the older an individual was in the sample, the more likely they were to have malnutrition. And all of these data is we're working on publishing this information. Demographic characteristics by nutritional status, some of these findings are not surprising. Women tended to have more likely to be malnourished, and older adults living alone in the community were more likely to be malnourished. And what we did find was that twice as many older adults living in residential care were malnourished as would be expected. So these are individuals living in assisted living or non-nursing home settings. And there was no difference in terms of race or ethnicity by their nutritional status. We also then looked at self-reported or health-related variables by nutritional status, and we found that malnourished individuals were more likely to self-report their health as fair or poor. They were more likely to have more chronic conditions. And if you look at the number of individuals who reported falls in the last year, more malnourished individuals reported falls in the last year and also reported being hospitalized in the last year. So these are, align with what we know about malnutrition risk factors in older adults. We also looked at food security by nutritional status, and malnourished older adults were more likely to use Meals on Wheels as reported in the NHATS data set, but we couldn't find any difference in our initial analyses based on food security items like skipping meals, how often they skipped meals, or whether or not they received food stamps or any other type of food assistance. There's a big emphasis today on diagnosing malnutrition and considering the inflammatory aspects of that. And we were really quite pleased to be able to explore this at a population level because NHATS 2017 does have CRP and IL-6 levels. So what we did was break down the median scores, categorize individuals, whether they fell below or above the median. And what we found was that compared to the normal, to the nourished group, those with malnutrition were more likely to have a CRP greater than the median, and this odds ratio was significant. And those who were at nutritional risk were more likely to have IL-6 levels greater than the median. And again, this odds ratio was significant. So what this points to is that when you look at categorizing older adults as having different levels of nutritional status, those that have malnutrition or are at risk for malnutrition do have inflammation as well. So in conclusion, to the best of our knowledge, this is one of the first estimates at a national level of looking at malnutrition in community dwelling older adults. And it's estimated about 6% of community dwelling older adults are malnourished, 26% are at risk. And this aligns with some of our previous data using a Southeast Pennsylvania cohort. Malnourished older adults are more likely to be older, female, live alone, and report worse self-reported health and use meals on wheels. And we were also able to demonstrate a relationship between inflammation and nutritional risk and malnutrition in community dwelling older adults. So of course there are limitations. Nutritional status we used derived measures based on items that correlated with the MNA that are found in NHATs. But what this does tell us is malnutrition is not limited to the hospital setting, and that there is an interrelationship among malnutrition and inflammation in older adults. And we really need to think about interdisciplinary approaches to address malnutrition in those older adults living in the community to promote healthy aging. And we're continuing to do this work, looking at the impact also on physical performance and malnutrition on health outcomes. So I want to thank my team and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and also for serving on the planning committee. So our final speaker today is Marjolein Visser. She is a professor of healthy aging in the Netherlands. She's a nutrition scientist and epidemiologist and a member of the steering committee on the longitudinal aging study in Amsterdam. She's also involved in other cohort studies and performs intervention work as well. Her research focuses on the role of lifestyle and in particular nutrition and physical activity in healthy aging. Her specific research areas include malnutrition, sarcopenia, and obesity as they relate to aging. As the chair of the Nutrition Committee of the Dutch Health Council, she is responsible for the development of the Dutch dietary reference values and other dietary guidelines. So she will be presenting some of her work for us here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Do you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you. I would like to talk a little bit about the assessment of dietary intake in older adults, which we've done in the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam. Just to give you a brief introduction about this study, it's a national representative sample of the Netherlands, and it now includes over 5,000 individuals. And it really has a multidisciplinary approach. So we focus on physical, cognitive, psychological, and social aging over time. And we repeatedly follow these people over time. So here you see a sort of schedule of our examinations. So the first cohort was already included in 1992. So we already have a pretty long follow-up of these people. And every 10 years, we include a new cohort to enrich the sample. And even included a migrant cohort of the first generation of Turkish and Moroccan people in the Netherlands. And we included that to our cohort study. So from the very beginning, we've done a lot of focusing on the nutritional status of older individuals, looking at weight and weight loss and appetite. But from the start, never a dietary assessment was actually included in the cohort. So I was very happy to get funding through an EU-funded project, the Mood Food Project, to add a thorough nutritional assessment to this cohort. So that was done in 2014 and 2015. And since then, these data have been used a lot. We've looked at dietary patterns in relationship to depression. We've looked at protein intake in relationship to functional outcomes and sarcopenia. And we're also looking at the sustainability of the diet. So how can you eat a healthy diet and maybe even improve protein intake while still maintaining a sustainable diet? So that's also one of our research focuses today. So how did we do this assessment? We, of course, invited people from participating already in the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam. So we selected those who were willing to participate in ancillary studies because this nutritional assessment was an ancillary study. As you can see, over 2,000 people were eligible to participate. And ultimately, we had dietary information of a little bit over 1,400 people. So the non-response, it's really those people who are very frail, but it's also people who are relatively young, very active, and do not have time. So it's a mixture in the non-response when you look at the dietary intake data. We offered people to do it either on paper or digitally. And very often people say, well, older people, you cannot do any online assessments. Well, you can very well do online assessments with older people. And about half of our sample actually took the questionnaire online. So with, of course, some advantages, because we had hardly any missings. Only when people stopped completing the questions, we had missings. While for a paper version, we very often had to call back people to ask their explanation. How did they change their answers? They skipped pages. So much more work if you do it on paper. So ultimately, the response rate was almost 70%, which is quite high. And for example, much higher than our national dietary survey. So it's good to embed this already in a longitudinal aging study. For validity reasons, we also selected a sample to do 24-hour recalls, actually 3 24-hour recalls. So we asked people in the food frequency questionnaire whether they would be willing for that additional data collection. And from that, we randomly selected people to perform the 24-hour recalls for validation. So I'll say a bit more about that later. So the food frequency questionnaire was a recently developed questionnaire. It was developed in a wide age range. So we wanted to do an additional validation study to see whether it would also be valid in only older people. So the reference period is 4 weeks. So we asked frequencies and portion sizes. And portion sizes, we used units or household units, but also a lot of pictures were in the booklet. So people could pick how much meat they would regularly eat, how much butter they would spread on their sandwich. So we worked a lot with pictures, and that worked really well. We had only a few people who skipped the questions after filling in some of the questionnaire. And actually, we also excluded data from people with implausibly high energy intakes. And we used the Walter Willett criteria for that. Now, there are also criteria for implausibly low energy intakes. But when we performed our 24-hour recalls, actually we realized that there are quite a lot of older people who have a very low energy intake. They do not feel well, they just have some tea, some toast, and they feel full. So we decided not to exclude the very low intakes, which is commonly done using Ffq information, but we decided not to do that based on the results from our 24-hour recalls. So the 24-hour recalls were performed on 2 weekdays and 1 weekend day. So before the first recall, we sent them an information package. We asked them to measure the content of frequently used kitchenware. And most of the people, about 90%, were perfectly able to do that. They actually weighed or put in the volume of their kitchenware. So that was very helpful for us. And we again sent a picture book with a lot of portion sizes. So when we did the interview, we asked them to pull up the portion size booklet and point whether it's A or B or C or D, whatever. So we did all the 24-hour recalls by phone, and we had unexpected calls, which is actually different from the way we do our national dietary survey, where people know they're being called, but we wanted to do it unexpectedly, not to influence their energy intake or any intake of that day. Just some characteristics of our validation sample of 88 people, quite representative of the total food frequency sample. So we were happy to see that. So we feel quite certain that the information from our validation is actually valid for the whole Ffq sample. So it's the average age is about 70 in this group. You see the MMSE score, we did not exclude anybody on basis of MMSE. Everybody could be in, they could be helped by their proxy if they wanted to. So their mean MMSE actually is 28 in this study. So just some validation results and some intake results. So energy intake around 2000, which we commonly see in this older population. The group level bias as a percentage, you see here, you see the Pearson's correlation coefficients. Maybe if you're used to validation study, this might be considered quite low, but for a nutritional validation, it's not low. And very important to us, whether people were actually ranked in the same or adjacent quintile, or when it's not very good, it's people are being ranked in the extreme quintiles, and that was actually very low. So some other results, and I cannot present everything, but just the highest correlations were around 0.7, the lowest one were about 0.2. So that's important to realize with everything in between. But again, the extreme quintiles, were very few people in extreme quintiles. So ranking people according to this FFQ, and also ranking people according to any food pattern index, such as the Mediterranean Diet Index or the Adjusted Healthy Eating Index, is very well possible in these kinds of samples. So here you see that there's not really a clear bias, that people with low intake underestimate and people with high intake overestimate. So that was very assuring to us. And with micronutrients, you see again, for some micronutrients, you see an overestimation using FFQ. Pearson correlation really range quite low for beta carotene, but actually the FFQ was not specifically developed for beta carotene, so that could be expected maybe. And again, the extreme quintiles was a very low percentage. Then, of course, we also look at food groups. We actually do a lot of analysis with food groups. You need the food groups also for many of the food pattern analysis, which we prefer to do. So here you see some results. Again, for some products that are not often being used, such as legumes, for example, you see an overestimation of the FFQ. And when you look at the extreme quintiles, you see some a high level of people being in extreme quintiles, so not being ranked very properly for legumes and fish. And I'll come back to that later on. So the conclusions, the group level bias is actually pretty small. The Pearson correlation coefficients are moderate to good, and the quintile agreement for the energy and macronutrients are moderate to high. So that looks all pretty good. For most of the nutrients and food groups, it also looks really good, except actually for fish and legumes, you see that there's not a perfect quintile agreement. So to discuss that, we see that the FFQ overestimated the intake of certain food groups, especially fish, eggs, nuts, seeds, and legumes. And for many of these items, the daily intake is quite low and the consumption is infrequent. So this is habitual intake of these type of food groups. It's not well captured by doing 24-hour recalls. So probably the FFQ estimate is actually better than a 24-hour recalls, but because we use the 24-hour recall as a reference, you get this kind of distinctions. Also, if we look at the correlations and any of the other validation data, we compare it with other Dutch validation studies conducted in younger adults, we actually see the same type of agreement and the same type of correlation coefficients. So performing or using an FFQ in an older population does not give you any poorer data compared to a younger population. You just have to deal with the same limitations of an FFQ. Also, when we look at our FFQ validation data in comparison with other FFQ data of older adult samples, we think it's very comparable. And also we used a validation method, a 24-hour recall by phone. We think that this method is much less affected by any visual limitations or physical limitations as compared to the FFQ. So this means that the errors in both methods are not very likely to be correlated and not inflating your validation. So I think that's a good point. So all these data are available for people to use. So just send us a message and people could well use the LASA data. So the last part I want to talk about is the assessment of dietary supplement intake. So in several waves, you just ask for a specific supplement use. So for example, only vitamin D or only another supplement. And we felt that the information was usually not optimally recorded. We do all the interviews at home, but still, for example, vitamin D in a multivitamin supplement could be missed because people only thought about vitamin D supplements and did actually not realize that there was also vitamin D in their multivitamin supplements. So in more recent waves, we record all the dietary supplement information the same way as we always do with medication use. So actually, during the home visit, the older people put everything on the table, all the medication, prescribed, non-prescribed, everything they use in the past 2 weeks. And then all the information from the labels is being recorded by the interviewers. So the brand name, dose, concentration, etc., frequency of use. So I think that gives us more complete information. So then you would probably think, well, then it's easy to calculate the actually intake of nutrient through these supplements, which is actually not the case, even though in the Netherlands we have a Dutch supplement database, which is updated every year. So it's updated with all the new brands, the labels, the concentrations, the dose, whatever. Still, even though we have that, and all this detailed information from the dietary supplements, it's still quite a hassle to obtain the true nutrient intake from these dietary supplements. And this is just one of the algorithms that we use. Sometimes people refer to something as a dietary supplement, and it's actually not a dietary supplement. Then a lot of them are in this database, but a lot of the supplements that people take are not in this database. So we have developed this algorithm in how to ultimately make sure that we have the best estimate of nutrient intake through dietary supplements in these older men or women. So this is just some information on how we assess our dietary intake and supplement intake, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Marjolaine, for that. That's an excellent overview of the LASA study, as well as the dietary supplements that you've been trying to collect as well. I think all of our speakers have given some really interesting perspectives on how we collect diet and dietary supplement data. And so we're now going to be moving into the Q&A session, where we're going to investigate some of these issues in a little bit more depth. And from the audience, I'm sure we have lots of questions. I know I do. So we'll hand it over to Hoda and Nicole to help us identify some of the questions from the audience first.
I think they're still coming in, so we don't have anything from the audience yet. If you do have any questions, please send them to the email on the project website.
I could start with a question while we're waiting. So we heard from various presenters alternative ways of assessing the diet. So we heard about dried blood spots and urinary metabolites. And I was just wondering if the panel had thoughts on what the utility of these are and how we can use those with existing dietary assessment methods.
I can try to give a perspective. I think that, what I was showing before is that why we have this strong feeling that diet really affects aging in a tremendous way. We have to admit that the evidence we have been able to gather so far, it's not satisfactory. And so part of the problem is that our tools may not be precise enough or valid enough to do this evaluation. And so I think that the science of evaluating dietary intake through biomarkers is growing. It's a work in progress. We don't really have a tool now that we can use. But imagine that an older person go to the doctor, and in the doctor office, they do a metabolomic test. Currently we spend $500, but it can really cost 5 cents. At scale, there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't. And that as part of their evaluation, they have a set of biomarkers that say, well, your diet is not really working. And so it's not just an intervention that is dedicated to a specific group of the population, but I would like to see that in the doctor office, and somebody that does any type of contact and that can receive this kind of evaluation. It's difficult to ask to the doctor, I think, to do a dietary intake questionnaire, but if you say, I have an algorithm that show you that somebody has serious problem in nutritional status, that I think is more feasible.
Thank you.
Follow up on that, Reagan, if you'd like. I also think that it's important for us to think about what we do from a research perspective versus what we can do in clinical practice and how to bridge that gap. And I think some of the larger studies are demonstrating what we can do from a research perspective, but how do we translate that then into practice, like Dr. Ferrucci said? And it'll take some time, but I think, we're moving in the right direction.
Helpful and good context. Thank you.
I can also add that when you use this dietary information to calculate dietary patterns, and I think Luigi has shown that, and we have shown that they're quite strong associations with outcomes. So it's often not a single nutrient maybe, but it's the pattern. And the Mediterranean diet score, or we have the Dutch Healthy Eating Index, which is a sort of index which gives you an estimate how well the diet matches the Dutch dietary guidelines. And you clearly see a benefit of people scoring higher on that with all kinds of outcomes. But it's more sort of a food group based approach in your analysis. So I think the two are complementary to each other. But if you want to have an exact estimate of a nutrient using an FFQ, that's not possible.
Yeah, I think, kind of triangulating exposure from many different forms of assessment is probably the way that we're going. Thank you.
I have a question for Marjolaine, who I think discussed how there was a bit of a limitation in being able to fully pull out supplement use in these older individuals. Were there strategies to get more accurate information from some people, or were there situations that emerged that you thought helped to get a good picture of what was going on in terms of supplement use?
Well, at least asking a person just to put on the table all the bottles that they use is already really improving your information. Because when you just simply ask a person, are you taking a vitamin D supplement? Some people say yes, but some people say, I have no clue. And we have done another research where it turned out that 15% of actually vitamin D users did not know that they were using vitamin D because it was hidden in a multivitamin or. So you really need the full picture and then start calculating from that. So that I think is a very important lesson. And you need actual access to the bottles because you need the information on the bottle, because people sometimes say, yeah, it's something bought at, well, this store, then, and it's a blue bottle, but then you still have 10 options. So it really needs sitting down and writing, copying everything from the labels. And only that is possible. Just using a questionnaire to ask for supplement use, I think it's not a good way to go. You need access to the bottles and ask, how much do you take of this bottle in the past 2 weeks? Yeah. So it's very labor intensive, but that's the only way to do it.
And I think that's what Shin Young's presentation highlighted, is the strength of the NHANES and seeing the bottles and capturing all that rich information, which is very difficult for people to recall on a questionnaire. Thanks.
I just want to remind the additional challenge, because I think there are some studies showing the label may not match the actual content in the bottle or in the pill, because they deteriorate sometimes, or the manufacturers just don't report the actual like real amount. So that's another challenge.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. And that's why we have that NES database, because they look at that. So they update the information. So we try to couple the information we obtain from the participants to that database, but still you'll end up with issues. So it's because even in a year, a company may change the amount of dose or whatever in a single pill. So you really need up-to-date information and an up-to-date database. And even though we have that yearly update in the Netherlands, it's still a challenge.
So I actually just wanted to raise the issue of the clinical population, which Dorothy sort of tapped into with Nutrition Day, and Roseanne indicated that the NHATs also had a residential group in there. And this group is especially, I think, vulnerable to malnutrition, right, and frailty, but it's really hard to understand their diet. So just want to give you a bit of space to think about, could we do something more along the lines of 24-hour recalls or 3-day records that we've heard others using, or food frequency questionnaire in that setting? Or do we use what we've been using, such as the food plate method, which Nutrition Day had, or the M&A as a screening tool or assessment tool that picks up a few items around food intake? Thoughts about that?
I want to spend a word for two aspects that we haven't touched on that are important when talking about a clinical population. The first one is anorexia. Anorexia of aging is a reality, and that's not how good is what you eat, is whether you eat or not. And we see that declining weight, especially associated with depression, is one of the pathology that is most difficult. So education about anorexia, I think it would be extremely important, and tools that can be applied systematically to look at anorexia is very important.
So looking at weight loss, it sounds like might be one of the key ways we can do that.
You can weight loss, but also asking people, having tools that allow you to do that, because I think that most of the time, everything medicalized, the anorexia is often, for example, in the elderly associated in oral health problem. Oral health problem, may not be so sophisticated in terms of the, quality of nutrition, but if you really look at all the people, in person, most of the time, that's what they're going to tell you, that, they select what they eat because they don't have denture, or their denture doesn't work very well, or they cannot swallow something. And so I think that we should not, scotamize this, if you want to avoid trivial, practical issues, but very, very important for older people.
I think some of that might get picked up in our nutrition screening workshop 3, where we're talking about some of those things as well. But Dorothy, I don't know if you have any comment, and Roseanne, and then go back to Marjolaine as well.
I can comment on that. My micro is on, yes.
Yeah.
I think the ability to report food intake very much depends on the cognitive abilities and also physical status, frailty status of the persons. I think it can work also in institutions, but very much depends on the individual capacity and ability of the person.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if what we really know about the validity of dietary assessments in very old people at home also. Marjolaine mentioned in the LASA study the comparison to other studies, but did you look within the LASA population? Did you compare younger and older participants there? So many were 80 years or older, and was the validity different in this older age group, or would it be
it's a very good question, Dorothy, but I'm afraid I cannot answer that at this point. So we did not do any, because we had a validation sample of 88. So we felt we could not stratify it more looking at similar age groups, but I definitely think it's a very good question. Yeah.
And also in the enhanced samples, there are several, or how many very old persons are in the enhanced sample?
I can't recall, but I think they are equally like represented, like 60, 70, and 80 for non-Hispanic white and other like race ethnicity. But for Hispanics and African American population that have like rather smaller population size, I think just 60 and older are the subdomain, sampling subdomain, and 80 and older are not like represented properly. I remember.
And they also top code at age 80 for confidentiality reasons. So we know that participants are 80 and older, but we don't know exactly how old they are, which is a limitation.
Yeah, but maybe the 80 plus group could be used and compared to the younger ones.
Of course, of course.
Gordon Jensen is on the planning committee, and I think he'll present some of his work on the longitudinal study of the oldest old from the Geisinger cohort at some point in the workshop series that at least gives some differential from the oldest old to the younger old.
But getting back to Heather's question, I think since we have several longitudinal cohort studies in the United States, we should probably think about, what kind of nutrition measures could be added to these, to future waves so that we can have some standardized data across these different cohorts. That could be really interesting.
Yep. Marjolaine, do you have a legacy hand up there, or is that a new hand?
No, I just wanted to make one comment because already the issue of malnutrition was addressed with, very poor, low body weight and weight loss. And Luigi already referred to the anorexia of aging. I also want to raise the point that we do see an increasing number of obese older people. And when we look at their diets, actually, we, for example, in our study, we noticed that the people who had a very low protein intake were not only the very skinny weight loss people, but also the obese people. So even at the high end of the weight distribution, you can see really important nutritional problems. So that we should not only focus on the anorexia issue, but also on the overweight issue and the poor dietary habits there. That's just, I think it's important too.
Any questions, Hoda or Nicole, from the audience?
Yeah, I have another question. So we've talked a little bit about top coding at 80, and given the fact that unlike other parts of adulthood where there aren't group health effects, older adults do start to break into certain health outcomes that are related to age. So given that, do you think that there is an impetus to not top code at 80 and maybe build in shorter time spans?
Yeah, the NHATS data does go up to beyond 80. And so you could group people 90 and above. So I think, but some of that data is restricted. So I think it just depends on how the data is collected in some of these different surveys, what you could get access to.
Yeah, the issue is always confidentiality, right? And you know, if you can drill down to a geographic area, then a certain age. But our population is aging such that that concern that might have been there 20 or 30 years ago when we were developing these surveys isn't there anymore. We do have numbers of people that are in that age group, right? So thinking about that, and you know, could we use 5-year categories even to make it a little bit more focused? Would be a way to go. That might be a recommendation for moving ahead, for sure.
And I think it's well feasible. I mean, our oldest FFQ participants was 102 years old, so it is possible.
I actually have a question actually around the technology and the very old. And you said, Marjolaine, that that older folks had no problem using your technology. Were they using something like the ASA 24, which is a 5-pass method for sorry, it was food frequency questionnaire. Sorry. So and was many foods. So I was actually surprised to hear that they had the tenacity to complete it. Any advice you'd give around the technology piece for people in the future who want to use technology in older adults for dietary assessment?
Well, it actually worked very well. And we raised this for the first time actually in the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam, because we saw so many advantages of doing an FFQ digitally with no skipped questions, etc. And actually the steering group was a bit on hold, like, oh, is this possible? And we said, well, we make it voluntarily. If people want to do it online, that's fine. And if not, then we just see what the outcome is. And then actually we were quite all surprised that half of the sample actually did it digitally. But I do think that the use of internet is quite high in the Netherlands. And it's not only biased to the high socioeconomic groups. We also have a large use in the lower socioeconomic groups. So that convinced us that we could use this methodology and that we would not have a bias to its socioeconomic status level. Especially in the old age group in the Netherlands, that bias is not there. So I think you have to be careful if you want to do only a digital rollout of your dietary assessment methods. You need some information about how well distributed internet use is and computer use is throughout your age groups. Yeah.
Kind of switching gears a little bit, we talked today about inflammation and aging and nutrition, and how do we handle that in our assessment methods? Does anyone have any insights or comments?
Can I just make one? I mean, this is a huge issue that you know, that nobody really completely understands. You know, why inflammation is affected by so many things: stress, nutrition, exercise. You know, all these behavioral change have an effect on inflammation. But we also need to think that inflammation affect nutritional requirement. I mean, there is strong evidence now, for example, that protein intake needs to be adjusted by its inflammatory status, because the synthesis of protein, especially in muscles, is downregulated by high inflammation. And if you supplement protein in this individual, you can normalize the protein synthesis. As I said, in the muscle, because we have studied, well, not we, but the field that study muscle, but I'm sure that is true also in other tissue. In particular, I think cartilage is so important because that's really the culprit of one of the most devastating disease that you see in old age, which is arthritis. So I think that, yes, we need to think about, you know, when there is inflammation, diet may be one of the causes, but it's not the only one. If there is a chronic inflammation, we need to think about how nutritional intake needs to be adjusted, not only in terms of a healthy diet, but I think protein intake is one of the things that we will need to think about.
Yeah.
One question, Marjolaine, you were talking about obese individuals. You see that they tend to have a prevalence of using carbohydrate and very little protein. Is that what would? That's so interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense, but yeah.
Yeah, if we looked at the distribution of the low protein eaters, we clearly have the the more skinny, weight loss, more anorexic people. And also in that same group, in the low protein eaters, were the obese people with obviously preferences for fatty and carbohydrate. But of course, that tremendously will increase their risk for sarcopenic obesity. So, and it's usually not a group you think of that you would need to stimulate protein intake. And of course, you want to avoid that if you stimulate protein intake, that you stimulate energy intake. But it's really a specific group that I think we need to address, and a group that's very often overlooked. Yeah.
But I'm not sure if we really answered Reagan's question about, were you specifically asking, should we be screening or assessing for inflammation in practice?
Yeah, I think that's an important in the nutritional context, and we're not always measuring it, and we know that that can affect all aspects of absorption and digestion. And has anyone proposed any ways to kind of model that? Or
I think that what I was saying before, what should be in the hand of a model practicing physician. What are the tools? I see a block between what we do in research and what is translated to practice. We do know that IL-6 and CRP are predictive of horrible outcomes, and still they're not used by anybody in practice. They're used to predict cardiovascular disease a little bit, but the rest, they're not. And it's becoming even more wider than that, because our knowledge about circulating biomarkers is exploding, but none of this explosion of knowledge has been translated into a new medicine. I think that should happen, because the evidence is really, really strong, and is based on large population, in some cases on randomized controlled trials.
Speaking of tools, I think there is a chance that recommended level can be different for these disease people, including people with inflammation, because the current dietary reference intakes are mainly for healthy people, but we know that older adults are suffering from many chronic diseases, including those impacting inflammation status. So if evidence allows, there can be some chances to set new recommended intake levels if possible.
I'm going back to what I said before. We actually demonstrated, that was one study, and of course need to be replicated, but that in people with high IL-6, the amount of protein intake necessary to maintain muscle mass over time was much higher. So those with high inflammation, as long as their intake of protein was high, didn't show any decline in muscle mass. Those that had high inflammation but low protein intake show accelerated decline on muscle mass. Now, I think that this is one example, and inflammation is one of the many things that we can see, but we need to start doing studies in the area that takes into account their heterogeneity. It comes from me that I mostly study healthy people, and I tell you, it's fun. It's easy. It's the easiest thing to do. But I'm completely aware that this is just one face of the medal.
At the same time, I think we should take into account that those with inflammation have many difficulties in eating. So inflammation also impairs appetite, and they should eat more, but it's very, very difficult to reach these higher amounts, in fact. So the question is also how to realize a better food intake in practice.
Yeah, I don't want to go outside the field that we're discussing, but we haven't even tried to block inflammation. I think that politically demonstrated that an antibody against IL-1 prevent cardiovascular disease. And then people have reanalyzed those data sets, showing that in the same population, blocking IL-1 prevented cancer, pulmonary disease, diabetes, multimorbidity, anemia. So clearly blocking inflammation is possible, but we haven't tried. And I think that maybe the solution is changing the nutrition and in some specific individual blocking inflammation. And that is something that we really need to try to do.
I don't want to take up all of the time with my questions. I want to make sure, Hoda, that we're covering questions from the audience as well.
If you wanted to go ahead, that's fine. We don't have anything new yet.
I promise this will be my last one. Several of the speakers today alluded to differences in nutritional intakes by sex. And how do we deal with that? And should we be making differential recommendations based on sex? Might be one of those Miss America questions that there's not really an answer to, but even comments on how different men and women are.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good comment. The only thing I can refer to is that we looked at that, looking at protein intake in relationship to outcomes, because protein intake is very often an indicator of protein intake. It's often expressed per kilogram of body weight. And of course, per kilogram of body weight means relatively more lean mass for a man compared to a woman. So we thought, is that a fair way to deal with the denominator of protein intake? So we looked at that and we played around with that in relationship to outcomes. But from those analyses, we could not have, and actually that's published, we could not see clear evidence that we should have different cut points or criteria for women compared to men. But I think it's only for now one of the few studies specifically looking at the gender issue. So I think we need much more, especially in relationship to outcomes where we know there are gender differences in the incidence of these outcomes. Yeah.
I was wondering if any of you could comment on, the first-hand accounts of dietary assessment versus some older adults who may need assistance or may have like a healthcare advocate reporting their diet on their behalf. I don't know if any of you have experience with that or can comment on it. That might have been the Miss America question.
Well, I'm not aware that there are studies done where an older person is reporting diet by him or herself, and whether it's done by proxy and that is compared. I'm not aware of any of these type of studies.
No, I would agree. I don't think there are, but I think thinking, Marjolaine, the longitudinal study of Amsterdam, you did have care partners potentially there supporting people. So maybe that's maybe we can comment on that. Is how did that work, and what did you do to facilitate that?
We just told people that they could be helped, because of course we have people with visual problems or functional problems that maybe would not be able to complete the questionnaire by him or herself. We also have experience using that same frequency questionnaire actually in a memory clinic sample, and there much more people relied on their partner or very often or child to complete the questionnaire, but it is possible to do it. But whether it's more valid, just as I said before, I have no idea.
Yeah, I think you can only put markers around, like if the person lives with the person they're living with, that sort of thing to support, because if they're living separate from the person, it's going to be really challenging, right? Yeah. I actually had a question that maybe it's sort of throwing it out there, but Shin Young talked about clustering of behaviors, and we've been talking about inflammation, and we've been talking about, trying to be identifying. I think Luigi and Marjolaine talked about similarities in terms of quality diet, right? They tend to be the same. I think that was Luigi actually his talk. Is there a subset of things that we should be collecting and think again about a clinical practice scenario versus surveillance or research purposes? Because we can always have wonderful methodologies, of course, when we're doing surveillance, but it can be challenging when we're getting into the clinical populations, or the challenge of persons with dementia, for example, or in a clinic setting, just trying to understand, is this person potentially not eating well and we need to be doing something for them? Is there a clustering of things that we should ask, or what should we be doing, I guess, would be my question to the group. Maybe that was the Miss America question.
It's an enormously complex question. I think that it's related to how we translate what we know and how we orient, our research to what is really needed. And sometimes I feel that we do not explore the problem enough to understand. And so there's a lot of work done in general population, and there is much less work that is done in nursing home or in residential. It's not just the typical nursing home, it's in the residential assisted facility that now exists in an incredible range of variety. And we have no idea how those work and what would be the question that we need to ask to improve that situation. And I think that if I have a suggestion, would be, much more contact within the research and the clinicians and those that care for all the people to really refine the question with them and not in theoretical terms. I mean, for example, I'm making a practical example. I talk about anorexia because by chance I was involved in an international group that is looking at anorexia in nursing home in 22 different countries. And over the age of 70, anorexia in nursing home affect 25% of the population. 25% of the population in nursing home, and nobody screamed for it. And so I think that's where I think the problems are. We shouldn't stop doing prevention through good nutrition. I think that's absolutely fundamental. It's the strongest tool we have in our hand. Exercise and nutrition are really the culprit of what we can do. But we shouldn't forget that there is an older population already that needs some help. And so that's another side of the story that probably need to be expanded.
Even in healthy community dwelling older adults, poor appetite is reported by 20% up to 25%. So it's also in this population, it's a problem. I think it's a good idea to complement dietary intake assessments by the step before, that is appetite question, the desire to eat. And on the other hand, maybe also to ask for weight, body weight development, so to get a more complete picture.
There was a recent study that was published in Europe where they looked at older adults admitted to a medical ward, and some individuals had malnutrition, sarcopenia, frailty, and cachexia, and there was great overlap amongst the four syndromes. And so I think a lot of what we see as well is an overlap of different conditions, and some sort of metrics is important, assessment items, right? And then be able to differentiate what condition is it, or does it even really matter? Because what are the interventions that are common across all four? I mean, I think those are some of the important questions.
Eat more protein and move more, right? Yeah. Yeah, great.
Well, I also do think that there's quite an emphasis now, at least in the Netherlands, in nursing homes, on the development of malnutrition. So people, the body weight is monitored over time. But I think nobody's looking at the dietary quality from another perspective. So are these people eating enough vegetable, fruits? I mean, it's really the basis on maintaining weight or avoiding weight loss. But the extra step, is it also a healthy diet? That's not being addressed still. So it should be and.
I will jump in there and say that I did lead probably the largest study on food intake in long-term care, and we measured food intake with researchers measuring it. But yeah, it's not great, and a third of the vitamins, more than 50% of the people are consuming less than the EAR. So it's not good at all, and that's diversity across provinces with very different drivers around what results in a menu. As we know, money and skill of people that are developing the menus are going to be a big part of it, but it's inadequate, absolutely, including protein.
Well, and it's also the socioeconomic model. Every country has its own way of paying for long-term care. And some of the assisted living facilities are very expensive. And some older adults will report that, whatever that one meal per day they receive, that's all that they eat. Because they don't have enough money to eat the rest of the meal. So it's problematic.
Well, of course, and that I think it's a very important problem and relevant to all countries. But I think it's also an awareness issue, and also awareness with all the people themselves. We did a sort of knowledge test, a protein knowledge test across 5 countries through the EU. And about 1/3 of the older adults did not realize that in 100 grams of beef, there was more protein than 100 grams of tomato. They crossed the wrong answer. So knowing that protein, most of them also thought that 1 meal per day with a good protein source was okay. So if you had just 1 hot meal with some meat or that would be okay. You had at least a good proper warm meal, and then you were fine. So there's also still, we have to still do a lot of work on the awareness that's not fine, and explaining that they understand what protein is. Because I think a lot of the information that we provide, it's not fully captured.
I think we're coming up to the close of the workshop, so I had one more broad question. I was hoping that, given your work, you could each comment on either one thing you think is being done very well in this area in nutrition surveillance of older adults, or one thing that you would really like to see change if you could have it your way and we lived in a perfect world. I won't say and, I'll give you the option of or.
Lived in a perfect world, I would like to see nutrition assessment or a nutrition screen be added to the Medicare annual wellness. And I think that would really make a great difference.
So in a dream world, I think that I would like people to think more about what they eat and the consequence that what they eat have on their future and the future of their family, their children, and their grandmother and grandfather. Understanding more that what they eat is really important. I mean, one thing that strikes me is looking at the 20 years old or the 15 years old. I think that what they're eating now is not going to have any consequence later on. By from life course epidemiology, we know that the imprinting of what they eat at that age is going to have extreme consequence later on. And I think that the culture that teach people that this is the case, that you build your old age starting from how you behave in young age, it's not there, and it should be there because the evidence is so strong that this is true. So I'd like this culture to be permeating, our population.
I like that. Sticking to dietary assessment part, I guess some technological advances in this word, like taking photos and some technologies processing those photos instead of asking older adults to report all they ate in a day or during a year. Those kind of advances in dietary assessment tools may be helpful for NHANES or other studies.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, but I think already for 15 years, people have tried to develop these kind of methods. And capturing food on the plate is probably much more harder than we would think. And I think the only reason advance that I really like, and it seems to work pretty well, it was actually developed in the Netherlands, is where you have an app and sometimes you get an unexpected message and you have to fill in what you ate the last hour, only the last hour. But if you do that randomly over time at different hours during the day, during the weeks, it's not a lot of effort for a person to complete, and the validity data look pretty good. So I think that's already more feasible maybe and more easy to do also in younger generations who do not like to fill in 238 item questionnaires. So yeah, maybe that might be an advantage and something that we could develop more. But I really liked the dream of Luigi. I think that's a very important dream. And I would also like that people realize that even when they do not have a healthy diet now, it's never too late to change and to move towards a more healthy diet, because your body will benefit from it immediately.
A great way to end this session, and I'll turn it over now to Carol Boucher to close the session, but I echo that optimism and the importance of prevention and early interventions.
Carol?
I can start. Yes, thank you everyone for your wonderful contributions to our workshop today. I think we learned a lot and illuminated many critical issues that we will continue to explore in the next few workshops. We thank all the speakers today for their valuable contributions and for all the valuable work in this area, very enlightening. To our audience, thank you for your attendance, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks for the next workshop in our series entitled Advances and Key Issues in Dietary Assessment of Older Adults. Thank you and see you soon.